The Illusion of Victory. December 7, 1941. The morning that changed the world. As the sun rose over the Pacific, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers turned into shadows of thunder. From their decks, hundreds of planes took off, their engines roaring like the voice of fate itself. Their destination, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. Explosions ripped through the quiet harbor as flames. Devoured steel and smoke covered the sky. In less than 2 hours, 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans killed. It was the most devastating surprise attack in U.S. history. Across Japan, people cheered in the streets. Newspapers printed the headlines in bold red letters. The Empire Triumphant. The Emperor's portrait was carried through Tokyo. The nation believed that victory had already been written by destiny. To the world, Japan looked unstoppable. In just a few months, their forces swept through the Pacific. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, all fell like dominoes. The Imperial Navy ruled the seas. The rising sun flag flew over half the Pacific. But beneath the glory, something crucial had been missed, something that would decide the war. When Japan's bombers left Pearl Harbor, they had failed to destroy America's most important assets. The aircraft carriers, they weren't even there. The Japanese had also left untouched the massive oil tanks, shipyards, and submarine bases, the heart of America's naval power. Admiral Yamamoto knew it immediately. Tactical victory, yes. Strategic disaster, absolutely. He understood what his fellow officers could not. You can burn ships, you can sink steel, but you cannot sink resolve. And at Pearl Harbor, Japan hadn't destroyed America's strength. They had ignited it. Within days, American factories shifted into overdrive. Thousands of workers filled assembly lines that never stopped. Women replaced men in factories. Machines roared day and night. New carriers, destroyers, and bombers rolled out every week. Across the ocean, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to the nation. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His voice united an entire country. Millions of Americans enlisted, driven not by fear but by fury. And from that fury, a war machine was born. Japan had believed the attack on Pearl Harbor would cripple America. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had given America purpose and an unbreakable reason to fight until the very end. Back in Tokyo, as news of American rearmament began to spread, Yamamoto wrote a private letter. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. The turning tide. The Pacific Ocean, June 1942. The waves were calm, but beneath that calm, history was about to shift forever. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan stood at the height of its power. Its empire stretched from the shores of China to the jungles of Burma, from the Philippines to the edges of Australia. The rising sun had never shone brighter. But power can create blindness, and for Japan's high command, that blindness would soon lead them straight into disaster. Their next target was Midway, a small, lonely atoll halfway between Asia and America. To Tokyo it seemed insignificant, but strategically it was everything. If Japan captured Midway, the path to Hawaii, and possibly the American West Coast, would be open. The Imperial Navy believed this would crush America's remaining hope once and for all. Yet what they didn't know was that the Americans were already waiting. Through months of relentless code-breaking, U.S. intelligence had cracked Japan's naval encryption. They knew the plan, the date, and even the trap Japan was setting. For the first time, it would be Japan walking into an ambush. June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. From the skies above the Pacific, dive bombers screamed down toward Japanese carriers. In just 5 minutes, the balance of the entire war changed. 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were engulfed in fire. Explosions tore through their decks. Flames reached toward the heavens, and the sea swallowed the pride of the Imperial Navy. The men who had once destroyed Pearl Harbor now watched their own fleet burn. Veteran pilots, irreplaceable aircraft, and years of naval experience vanished in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, hundreds of miles away aboard his flagship Yamato, received the reports in stunned silence. He read them one by one. The carriers lost, the planes destroyed, the crews gone. Every message cut deeper than the last. He closed his eyes and whispered the truth no one dared to speak. The war is lost, but the Empire refused to hear it. Tokyo newspapers still spoke of victory. Government broadcasts called it a minor setback. Yet deep within Japan's naval headquarters, the admirals knew the truth. Midway had destroyed the very heart of their navy. Unlike the Americans, Japan couldn't rebuild quickly. Their shipyards were few, their fuel was running out, and their best pilots had perished. The Imperial Navy that once ruled the Pacific was now crippled, a giant with broken wings. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America was reborn. Factories roared. New carriers were launched every month. Young men volunteered in the thousands, determined to finish what had begun at Pearl Harbor. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back again. Midway was more than just a battle. It was a revelation, a moment when Japan's admirals realized that their empire had reached its limit. For the first time, the meeting of shadows. Tokyo, late June 1942. Rain poured over the city like a curtain of grief. The sound of thunder echoed through the imperial capital as a group of black cars moved silently through the night. Inside those cars sat the men who had once commanded the most powerful navy in the Pacific, Admirals Yamamoto, Nagumo, Kondo, and several others. Their faces were grim, their uniforms immaculate. But behind their eyes was something new, doubt. They were being called to a secret meeting at the Naval General Staff Headquarters. No journalists, no photographers, no trace that it had ever happened. When they entered the room, the lights were dim, the air thick with the smell of smoke and wet uniforms. Maps of the Pacific covered every wall, but this time the red lines of expansion had stopped, replaced by circles of loss, by the black X of sunken ships. At the center of the table lay 4 photographs. Akagi Kaga Soryu Hiryu, the pride of the Imperial Navy, now twisted metal at the bottom of the sea. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the dripping of rain against the windows. Finally, Admiral Yamamoto stood up. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of a nation's failure. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are not here to speak of honor. We are here to face truth." He looked around the table, his eyes sharp but filled with sorrow. "We believed that Pearl Harbor would end America's will to fight. Instead, it gave them a reason to fight forever. We believed that we could win through speed, through surprise. But war is not spirit. War is steel. And steel belongs to those who can build it." No one dared to interrupt him. These were words that would never be spoken in public. Words that could cost him his career, or worse. But everyone in that room knew he was right. Admiral Nagumo, his voice shaking slightly, broke the silence. "We still have battleships, cruisers, men ready to die for the Emperor." Yamamoto turned toward him slowly. "Men who are ready to die," he said, "cannot win against men who are ready to build." The room fell silent again. Even the thunder outside seemed to pause. For hours they studied the reports from Midway, the production numbers from America, and the dwindling fuel reserves of Japan. Every number told the same story, a war impossible to win. By midnight the rain had stopped. The admirals left the building one by one, their boots echoing on the stone steps. Not a word was spoken, but in their silence, the truth was deafening. Japan's dream of a Pacific empire was dying. Not in battle, but in reality. Yamamoto remained behind, staring at the map of the Pacific. He traced the ocean with his finger, from Tokyo Bay to Midway, to Hawaii, and beyond. The sea we once ruled will soon rule us. The lights flickered. The room went dark. And with that, the meeting of shadows ended. A secret gathering that marked the beginning of Japan's long descent into defeat. The crumbling empire. By late 1942, the Empire of Japan was still vast, but it was no longer strong. Its soldiers marched across the jungles of Asia. Its navy still patrolled the Pacific. And yet, deep within the empire's heart, something was breaking. The first cracks appeared not in battle, but in supply. Fuel, the lifeblood of war, was vanishing. Every Japanese aircraft, every destroyer, every submarine depended on oil. But the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies could no longer meet demand. Tankers were being sunk faster than they could sail. And America's submarines, silent and unseen, had turned the Pacific into a graveyard of steel. Without fuel, ships could not move. Without movement, Japan's empire began to choke itself. Factories in Tokyo and Yokohama once roared with production. But now the machines stood still for hours each day. There was no metal, no fuel, no spare parts. The miracle of early victories had faded into exhaustion. In the skies, Japan's pilots, once the most feared in the world, were dying faster than they could be replaced. The elite men who had trained for years before the war were gone. In their place came boys, barely 18, rushed through flight school, given only a few hours of training before being sent into combat. They were brave, yes, but bravery cannot replace experience, and courage cannot outfly radar, technology, and numbers. In the villages of Japan, mothers began to receive letters, folded neatly, sealed with the imperial crest. Each one carried the same message: "Your son died with honor." But honor did not fill the empty rice bowls. Honor did not warm the homes that grew colder every winter. Meanwhile, America was becoming unstoppable. New carriers, new planes, new tanks. The flood of industry had become a tidal wave. Every week another Japanese island fell. Every month another convoy disappeared beneath the waves. The Japanese high command tried to hide the truth. Newspapers still printed victories that didn't exist. The radio spoke of destiny and glory, but the people could feel the truth in their bones, that the empire's light was dimming. In the Navy, officers whispered that Midway had been a wound from which Japan would never recover. And now that wound was bleeding faster than ever. Admiral Yamamoto continued to travel with the fleet, his face calm, his voice steady, but his eyes told a different story. A story of a man watching his own creation crumble. He had built the Imperial Navy to be invincible. Now it was drowning in the very ocean it once ruled. Every battle lost meant fewer ships. Every ship lost meant fewer men. And every man lost meant the fading of a dream. The dream of an empire that could never be conquered. By the end of 1942, Japan still held territory across the Pacific. But in truth, the war was already lost. The admirals knew it. The soldiers suspected it. Lessons from Midway. Winter, 1942. Snow fell quietly over Tokyo, covering the city in a blanket of white, as if the heavens themselves wished to hide what was coming. Inside the Naval General Staff Building, Japan's senior officers gathered once more. The reports from Midway had been studied for months, dissected line by line, but the answers they searched for still felt unreachable. How had they fallen so far, so fast? How could an empire that once ruled the Pacific lose everything in a single battle? The lessons of Midway were written in fire, and every admiral in that room knew it. Admiral Ugaki, his hands trembling over the papers, spoke first. Our pilots fought with honor. They fought with spirit, but spirit alone cannot win a modern war. His words echoed painfully through the silent hall. For years, Japan had believed that courage and sacrifice could overcome any enemy, that the samurai soul was stronger than machines or metal. But Midway had proven otherwise. Admiral Yamamoto listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the map of the Pacific. 4 great carriers gone, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, thousands of the best trained men lost forever. It was more than a defeat. It was a mirror, showing them the limits of their own beliefs. He finally spoke. Midway taught us that the war we fight is not the war we imagined. We are fighting an enemy who learns, who adapts, who builds faster than we can destroy. He paused, his gaze heavy. And yet we continue to believe that courage can replace fuel, that loyalty can replace steel. These are noble illusions, but illusions nonetheless. Around the table, no one moved. These were dangerous words, truths that clashed with everything Japan's government told its people. But they were truths that could no longer be denied. From Midway, the Navy learned that technology had changed warfare forever. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, now decided the fate of nations. Radar, code-breaking, logistics, these were the new weapons of victory. And in all of them, Japan lagged behind. Yet, perhaps the hardest lesson was not about machines, but about pride. For years, Japan's leaders had believed their empire was destined to rule Asia, that their people were chosen by history itself. But Midway shattered that illusion. It reminded them, brutally, that destiny favors the prepared, not the proud. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softly covering the streets where civilians lined up for food and coal. The empire still spoke of glory, but the people were already living in scarcity. And in the quiet corners of Tokyo, some began to whisper that perhaps this war, this grand dream of empire, was built not on strategy, but on arrogance. Midway had taught Japan everything it needed to know to survive. But it was a lesson learned too late, because across the ocean, America had already understood the same lesson, and had turned it into power. The weight of realization. Tokyo, early 1943. The winter had turned bitter. The once proud capital of the Empire of Japan was now a city of long lines and quiet fears. In every home, people whispered about food, about rations, about sons who never came back. And in the Navy's highest chambers, the admirals began to whisper too, not about victory, but about survival. But for the first time since the war began, the meetings no longer began with confidence. The maps of the Pacific, once covered in red arrows of conquest, were now filled with circles of retreat. One by one, Japan's strongholds were being erased. Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Bismarck Sea. Each loss cut deeper than the last. Each defeat stripped away another layer of illusion. The empire that had risen like a storm across Asia was now shrinking, mile by mile, island by island. But inside the Naval Staff headquarters, the mood had changed. Where there was once shouting, there was silence. Where there was once certainty, there was doubt. Admiral Yamamoto sat by the window. His uniform immaculate, but his face tired, older than his years. He looked over a report listing Japan's remaining carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and a handful of others. He knew they weren't enough. He had seen what America could do. The endless factories, the steel rivers of production, the ships rising faster than Japan could sink them. He turned to his aide and said softly, "We are fighting a war of exhaustion, and only one side has the strength to endure." The aide didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew what he meant. But weeks later, in a late-night meeting, Admiral Nagumo broke the silence with trembling hands. "If we cannot win," he said, "what then? What becomes of the empire?" Yamamoto stared at the floor for a long time before replying. "Then we do what the samurai have always done. We fight until there is nothing left to fight for." His voice was steady, not out of confidence but conviction. He knew the truth, but he also knew Japan's leaders would never surrender. The idea of defeat was not just forbidden, it was unthinkable. And yet, in the back of every admiral's mind, the same thought echoed like a ghost. Pearl Harbor had not been their victory. It had been the beginning of their end. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and now that giant was walking. By spring, Yamamoto boarded a plane to visit the front lines in the South Pacific. He wanted to see the men who were still fighting, still believing. But fate was already waiting for him. American codebreakers had intercepted his flight plan. On April 18, 1943, his plane was ambushed and shot down over Bougainville. The mastermind of Pearl Harbor, the man who had both built and predicted Japan's fall, was gone. When the news reached Tokyo, the admirals stood in silence. Some saluted, because they all knew the death of Yamamoto was more than the loss of a leader. The hidden truth. Summer 1943. The sun still rose over Tokyo every morning, but it no longer felt like victory. The newspapers continued to speak of progress. The radio still played songs of triumph and loyalty, and the emperor's voice, calm and distant, still promised that Japan's destiny was eternal. But behind the walls of the Imperial Navy, the truth had become impossible to hide. The once proud fleets of the rising sun were now scattered ghosts across the Pacific. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, sat in harbor, too precious to risk, too slow to matter in a war now ruled by the skies. Japan's carriers were few, their planes outdated, their pilots inexperienced. Every battle cost lives they could no longer replace. And every week, American bombers came closer. What had once been a distant war now echoed in the skies over Tokyo itself. Inside the Navy's underground headquarters, officers worked by candlelight. Fuel was too scarce to waste on electricity. Maps hung on the walls, filled with blue and red pins. Each red pin was a Japanese stronghold. Each week, more red pins were replaced with blue. An officer stared at the map and whispered, "At this rate, the ocean will soon belong to them." No one answered, because they all knew it already did. Yet in public, the illusion continued. Posters on the streets showed smiling soldiers, holding flags beneath a rising sun that promised endless glory. Teachers told children that Japan would soon conquer the world. Women worked in munitions factories, singing songs of courage as they built weapons that would never reach the front. The truth was spoken only in whispers, in dark rooms, in coded letters, in tired glances. One admiral wrote in his private diary, "We are no longer fighting to win. We are fighting so that we do not lose too quickly." But even as the empire weakened, pride remained unbroken. Surrender was still seen as shame. To die in battle was still the highest honor. So Japan fought on, even when logic said it was over, even when hope had vanished. The government feared that if the truth reached the people, the entire nation would collapse from within. So the truth was buried beneath propaganda and lies, a mask worn by an empire that refused to face its reflection. By late 1943, Japan was a nation trapped between two worlds. The image of power it showed the world, and the quiet desperation that filled its heart. Factories ran on empty fuel. Children collected scrap metal in the streets. Families listened to the radio and pretended to believe. And yet beneath it all, every whisper, every silence, every empty sky carried the same unspoken question. How much longer can we pretend? The admirals already knew the answer. The tide had turned. The empire was crumbling. And soon, the hidden truth would reach everyone. Through fire, through ashes, and through the sound of bombs falling over the capital itself. The day they knew, winter 1944. Tokyo's skies were colder now, not with snow, but with silence. The silence that comes before something ends. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific was shrinking by the day. The same oceans that had carried Japan's ambition were now the highways of its destruction. Every wave brought something new. American ships, bombers, and a truth that could no longer be denied. In an underground war room beneath the Imperial Palace, a handful of officers stood before a massive map of the Pacific. The red lines that once marked Japan's expansion had been pushed back, island by island, battle by battle, until they formed a small, trembling circle around the homeland. No one spoke, because no one had to. The silence itself was the confession. An admiral, once proud, now pale and tired, broke the silence with a whisper that echoed through the room. "This is the day we knew." The men didn't ask what he meant. They all knew. It was the day they realized that Pearl Harbor, the attack that had once symbolized Japan's greatest triumph, had in truth sealed its fate. The Empire's victory had been an illusion, a flash of light that blinded them from the darkness ahead. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had dreamed of dominance. But dreams can only survive when reality allows them to. Now reality had arrived, in the form of relentless air raids, starving cities, and a new American weapon whose power no one yet understood. The Navy was broken, the Army scattered, and the people had begun to lose faith. Even the Emperor's words no longer carried the same divine calm, because behind them, everyone could hear the sound of warplanes approaching. That night, a firebombing raid swept across Tokyo. The sky turned red. The wind howled through the ruins of what was once the heart of an empire. Men who had once fought for glory, now fought to save their families from the flames. And as the city burned, one general stood on a rooftop and whispered to himself, "We have awakened a giant, and he will not sleep again." By morning, half the city was gone. But the truth that had been hidden for years was finally visible in the smoke that covered the sunrise. Japan was losing, not just the war, but the very idea of who it was. The nation that had believed itself invincible was now surrounded, outmatched, and out of time. The illusion was over. The empire was falling, and for the first time since the war began, its leaders no longer asked, "How do we win?" but "How will this end?"